Minister Niall Collins says he didn't break any laws in relation to the sale of land in Limerick in 2008. The Limerick deputy has been under pressure to address the issue after details of the sale of this land were first reported by the Ditch website. Our political correspondent Gavin Riley has this report on events from the Dáil today.
8 days after the first reporting about his role in council meetings where land was eventually sold to his wife, Niall Collins made a Dáil statement with a note of contrition.
Given the focus and perception amongst some that has arisen in 2023, some 15 years later, it would have been better had I not participated in the local area committee meeting in January of 2007.
But he insisted that when it came to the law, everything was above board.
I am in absolutely no doubt that my actions in relation to this matter were at all times legally correct.
There were no follow-up questions permitted to his statement, something which caused consternation at leaders' questions earlier. The Taoiseach reminded that he once sacked Barry Cowan for a similar stance.
Why is there one rule for Niall Collins and another for other members of your government and your party? Do you agree with the Taoiseach that questions and answer sessions turn the Dáil into a kangaroo court?
But Micheál Martin said the demand for questions had been led by the news website The Ditch, which he called a political operation, challenging the motivation of its major benefactor.
Paddy Cosgrave's post earlier this year, and he's a strong supporter and has deep connections between the Web Summit, Paddy Cosgrave and this organisation. And what did he say? Maybe it's time to body bag. That's a tweet. A few minions in media, civil service, charities, judiciary, private sector. We're not facilitating
Time
this.
is up.
He in turn was accused of playing politics.
Without the Ditch, Robert Troy would still be a minister. Without the Ditch, Damien English would still be a minister. No wonder you're attempting to undermine the Ditch.
If you read all the tweets of Paddy Cosgrave or Shea Bowes in respect of myself or in respect of other political leaders on this side of the House, it's very clear their agenda is to take down the government. That's fine, they're entitled to have that. But I understand what it is, but I'm not going to facilitate it.
But that all happened without Collins' presence or a reply. His concession not enough to convince his critics.
Gavin Riley reporting for us earlier this afternoon. Now, for more reaction, I'm joined by Irish Mirror political correspondent Louise Byrne, People Before Profit TD Paul Murphy, and Fine Gael TD Emer Higgins. You're all very welcome to the programme. Louise, I want to start with you. We got a flavour, I suppose, of some of the interactions in the Dáil today. What was the atmosphere like, given the fact that this is a story that has really plagued Niall Collins and the government for almost a week now?
Yeah, it was kind of a day of two halves, to be honest. Like you saw there, we had Micheál Martin standing up in the Dáil and leaders' questions, getting quite angry with the opposition and talking about the Ditch, who originally broke this story, and kind of chastising and criticising them. Tempers were quite flared, and I think Holly Kearns, the Social Democrats, and indeed Paul were quite annoyed that the Taoiseach wasn't actually answering questions that had been put to them. And that was quite, was quite angry in parts and quite highly strung. And then later on, when you'd Niall Collins coming in to make his own statement, he was quite calm, he was quite straightforward, quite straight to the point, and he had the piece of paper in front of him. And I think, as we've seen the last time Minister Collins made a statement, he read the statement in full. There was no deviation. It was very straight to the point and much calmer than it had been in leaders' questions, which was quite interesting. If anything, you would think it would be the other way around.
And Niall Collins was adamant, sort of the essence of his piece was, I should have maybe excused myself, but no law has been broken here.
Yeah, and I think this is what we have been hearing from Fianna Fáil all week, and indeed from three coalition leaders. Minister Collins said that he was in that meeting in January 2008. He said that the land was discussed. In hindsight, 15 years later, given the attention that's on it now, perhaps he should have stepped out, but he was really keen to emphasise that his participation in that meeting had no influence on the fact that the land was ultimately sold to his wife. He argued that there was multiple bids over a 6-month period. His wife's bid was the highest. She got that. He was insistent he broke no laws, and he said he's absolutely in no doubt about that. I think the only thing that we really did hear from him was that he should have recused himself. I think the opposition and Richard Boyd Barrett of People Before Profit were saying that he didn't answer any questions. So it'd be interesting to know what questions they still want answered.
Yeah, and Paul Murphy, that's the question I have for you. What questions, or do any questions, remain at this point?
I mean, the only substantial question that half remains, I don't really think it remains much anymore, is did he know, did Did he know his wife had expressed an interest in buying the land when he participated in the decision of the council to put it up for sale? And I think he implicitly admitted today that he did know that by saying that in hindsight he would have recused himself. Because obviously it wouldn't make any sense to recuse himself if he didn't know that his wife. And so then that, for me, is entirely clear. He's then in breach of the Code of Conduct for councillors. He's in breach of the Local Government Act, because that act is very, very clear. If you're participating in a decision where a connected person to you, which includes your spouse, has material interest, either beneficiary or pecuniary, in the matter that's being discussed, here was putting the land up for sale, well, then you have to declare your conflict of interest and leave the meeting and not play any part. And he didn't do that. So in reality, what he was doing, he wasn't representing people who elected him. He was using his position to help enrich his wife and his family.
Okay, and he would say that absolutely wasn't what he was doing, that there had been a number of expressions of interest in this piece of land prior to this meeting in January 2007, that the ultimate decision about whether to sell this land was carried out when he was no longer a councillor, and that was only carried out by a full council, that local area authority did not have the authority to decide on the sale of that land.
But they had the authority to put the land up for sale. His wife expressed an interest in the land through a solicitor in December. 1 month later, this is when the meeting of the local area committee took place. It's true that the council management says there's a multiple interests in the land. Through the FOIs, there is only one interest that comes up, which is his wife. Similarly, the reference to multiple bids. He actually referenced 3 different bids today, and he implied that they were from three different people. But two of those bids were his wife. There was a bid when he was still a councillor in March for 110,000. Then there was another bid. We don't know who that was from. We don't know for certain that it wasn't from his wife. And then there's the final bid, which is from his wife, 148,000.
Yes,
which
this went through an auctioneer, this process. What he was saying was that in January 2007, there wasn't a vote on this. There was no disagreement. There wasn't.
There was a decision. And it's very, very clear in the minutes. He participates in the minutes. The members were in favour of the proposal.
Okay.
And it's very, very clear. I mean, you could read the Code of Conduct. People should go online and look at it. It's very clear. In this situation where someone has a pecuniary interest, which she does.
So you just disagree with his interpretation, I suppose, of what a pecuniary or beneficial interest is. There's no further questions at this point.
It's not just that I disagree. Him and the Taoiseach deliberately misstate what the requirement in the law is. They say otherwise. They say they don't have an interest in the land. Of course he doesn't have an interest in the land. It's owned by the council. But they have an interest in the matter being discussed, and that's what it says in the legislation.
All right, Emer Higgins.
I was county councillor in South Dublin County Council for 8 years. And I suppose I'm very aware, because it was always my experience, that decisions to sell land belonging to the county council, all of those decisions happen at full county council meetings. And what happens before that is what's called local area committee, where the immediate local councillors are informed of the recommendation of management. At that meeting, you don't have the power to say no. You have the power to note it or to note objections to it, but no decision is taken until that full county council meeting. That full county council meeting, Niall Collins was not there, did not participate, did not vote, was not in the chamber, was not a county councillor.
What some people will have an issue with is why, I suppose, Niall Collins and why the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach seem to have such difficulty with the idea of Niall Collins coming into the Dáil and taking questions on this from an opposition. Is it full accountability, Emer Higgins? If you write a statement, you decide what is right and wrong within that statement, and then you give no opportunity to opposition to ask questions of that. Is that accountability in the Dáil in 2023?
Well, listen, firstly, if there's, and I know some people, as Paul has just said, have raised legal queries about this, right? They're legal queries. They're not for the Dáil. They're for the courts to determine. In terms of the Dáil, what it is there for is a mechanism for the opposition to hold TDs and ministers to account.
But how did they hold him? How did they get an opportunity to hold him to account? Because the Taoiseach yesterday said the holding of account, the questioning of government members on something like this was akin to a kangaroo court.
Well, he came in, he made his statement. In my mind, that clarifies things, and it absolutely does. And you asked Paul Murphy what questions remain, if any, and there aren't necessarily questions remaining because he has clarified things. And that is the transparency. That's the world in which we operate in.
Should he have taken questions? Would you have preferred that?
That's up to him. I mean, we have had a situation where in the past some ministers have taken questions because they felt it was in their interest to take all the questions, clarify everything. Minister Collins obviously felt his statement clarified things, and having heard his statement, I do agree it has clarified the situation.
Would Fine Gael have preferred if he had taken questions and actually possibly drawn a line under this?
I believe a line has been drawn through his statement. I think his statement has been really clear on this.
Why is it always your party, though? Because we've seen recently, you know, Pascal Donoghue had to go in and take questions, Leo Varadkar had to go in and take questions, but Niall Collins didn't. So is that not an equity there?
No, nobody had to. The ministers chose to, exactly.
Okay.
So our ministers have chosen.
Has there been, Louise, different support given to Niall Collins than perhaps was given to Damien English or to Robert Troy?
I think in the Damien English instance, he resigned straight away. And, you know, he after that, when you're not a minister, you're not accountable to the Dáil. I know there were questions for him, or calls for him to go in and answer questions. At that stage, he wasn't a minister, so hands were tied. He stood down straight away. I suppose with Robert Troy, there was kind of more of a drip feed of information. And I think that was really the big issue, is that with the Robert Troy thing, it was kind of more information day after day after day, and that didn't necessarily help his case. And eventually he did go. It's interesting to see the difference in between them, and the timing of it's interesting too, because this has actually happened during Dáil term, whereas the other two, we were on holidays both times. So I don't know if that makes a difference, but it's been an interesting kind of way of looking at it.
Emer, the comments from the Taoiseach today about the Ditch website, what did you make of those comments?
I suppose I was taken aback by them. What the Taoiseach implied really was that some of the articles on the Ditch were misleading, and in some cases had information that was false. As we know, he questioned kind of the sensationalism of it in terms of that online campaign. And he's obviously of the view that there have to be questions answered in relation to the funding of the site. I believe a statement has happened today,
But you would accept, though, that this website has been correct in the stories it has written about certain ministers, and that those statements, those stories have led to the resignation of government ministers.
They have indeed, and they've put important information in the public domain. And at the end of the day, that has to be welcomed, because our political democracy is built on transparency and it's built on trust. But at the same time, we obviously need to look beyond just headlines and scratch the surface and see the facts behind stories. And I think in this instance, it's been a good example of scratching behind the headline, seeing the facts of the matter and laying them out for the Dáil and for the public to see.
I mean, Niall Collins didn't dispute any element of the story that was published by The Ditch. That is the truth. He's tried to distract from it, but the core elements of the story, they all completely stand up. So what we saw today was, I think, a really cynical and a really dangerous attack on a media institution by the Taoiseach to try and distract from the key issue in terms of Niall Collins and to try to undermine The Ditch. Why? Because they've published stories that he doesn't like. And because they've published stories that expose corruption, unethical behaviour, and they have resulted in multiple resignations. They've done good journalism, and then he's out to undermine it. And I think that's very dangerous. He used the privilege of the Dáil to do it. He used the privilege of the Dáil to describe PBPTDs as puppets of Putin. He wouldn't repeat it outside because he knows it's a complete lie. So it's a very, very dirty kind of politics he likes to engage in, I think.
Louise, what have the Ditch said about this? They have issued a statement to you?
Yeah, they have. So they issued a statement to us earlier, and they said that rather than address the facts about Niall Collins, Micheál Martin launched an hysterical, paranoid attack on the Ditch under Dáil privilege. And he had suggested they paid for advertising. They said they've never done so. They said they've never criticised other media not picking it up. They also said that he had mentioned their funding. They said they're funded by subscribers and Web Summit, but they kind of said that there's nothing untoward happening there.
Very quickly, is this the end of the matter, do you think, for Niall Collins?
I think it seems to be. I think, you know, he went into Dáil, he made the statement. I think, barring any other information or any other stories, I think he is out the gap on this.
All right, look, we're going to have to leave it there for now. My panel, though, are going to be staying with me, because after the break, why far-right protesters are targeting Paul Murphy's home as he prepared to give his baby a bath this week. Well, a group of protesters turned up outside the home of People Before Profit TD Paul Murphy and his partner earlier this week, just as they were preparing to give their newborn baby a bath. The Dublin TD posted a picture of 11 people outside his home in Tala. Well, for more on this now, Paul Murphy has stayed with me, as well as political correspondent with the Mir, Louise Byrne, Fine Gael TD Emer Higgins, and scientist and disinformation expert Dr. David Robert Grimes. You're very welcome to the programme. We're going to start with you, Paul. This was just a couple of days ago, Monday night. Tell me exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, we were just literally getting ready to give Juniper a bath, and my partner Jess just glanced out the window and saw that there's a crowd of people out there with placards, a big tricolour, and then we realised, oh wow, like this is a protest, which we weren't expecting. It's quite a shocking thing to happen. Not to see a protest, obviously I see a lot of protests in my life, but to see a protest outside your home, in your neighbourhood, when you're, you know, on your downtime. And I think it's something I've thought about afterwards. It's a point we often make about the housing crisis, is like how important it is for people to have, you know, a safe space, that's their space where you can go and relax and you know everything is kind of normal. And so it was, yeah, a bit shocking and I suppose upsetting.
And difficult too, because it's not just you in the house, as you say.
Yeah.
Your partner is there and Juniper is there too, and your duty is to protect them and to keep them safe too.
I mean, and to be clear, like, you know, they didn't attack the house or anything like that. But obviously, their presence outside means you can't relax. You're not likely to just go about your day. And I also would say for my neighbours who, whatever about us, I don't think we deserve this, but my neighbours definitely don't deserve this. They didn't do anything to draw this into. Do you know what I mean? We're in a cul-de-sac. It's not on a main street. It's not in a busy area. So to have a crowd of people hanging around at a corner outside someone's house obviously isn't pleasant for them either. It's quite disturbing for them and in their location.
How long did they stay for? Were they saying anything? They seem to have had placards there?
Yeah, they stayed about an hour and a half. I mean, some of them were online, were live on TikTok and stuff. The placards and the main thing that they were saying was given out about refugees, you know, saying fake refugees, that kind of stuff. But then actually they were giving out a leaflet to people who passed by, which was opposing our bill to insert the right to housing in the Constitution. So there's a kind of conspiracy theory out there to say that if we do this, then the government will seize people's homes, when in reality it's about saying that we could have more effective rent controls, we could have an extended eviction ban, things like that.
And is that why you were targeted, do you feel?
I don't know, really. I think that People Before Profit have been to the fore, working with lots of other groups, but been to the fore in terms of challenging some of the ideas of the far right. We helped to drive the big mobilisation on February 18th, the day Juniper was born. The Ireland for All protest was tens of thousands of people on the street saying, let's unite, let's not be divided, fight together for housing, for public services, for jobs. So we've been upfront, and I've been upfront, you know, on Twitter and so on, in terms of calling these people out repeatedly and in the Dáil. And I think certainly that's part of the reason why they've targeted us. And it is a bit of a feature. Obviously, they do target government politicians to some extent, but also opposition TDs. I mean, the most serious thing that's happened to a politician in this country is Martin Kenny, the Sinn Féin Justice spokesperson.
Who we've had on the programme, who spoke at length about the intimidation his family faced and the fact that they actually had to move
out of their house. They
out
had
of their family home.
Car burnt down. And at the moment, definitely, People Before Profit and Solidarity are, you know, in the sights of these people. Mick Barry is being harassed on a very regular basis now.
And what does that feel like?
It's obviously unpleasant. It doesn't, to be clear, deter me at all. I've been through worse things in terms of political campaigning. I spent time in an Israeli jail for trying to break the blockade of Gaza. I obviously went through a very long trial in terms of the protest in Jobstown. So, you know, as a socialist activist, you can face difficulties. So it's a pain to have to deal with it. Like this week, I've been trying to focus on the whole Niall Collins story and trying to pursue that. We had a bill on Wednesday to reduce rents. And I think there is a point there. These people like to portray themselves as anti-establishment. But in reality, certainly this week, but I think on lots of occasions, they're actually attacking the ones who do, I would argue, the best job in terms of criticising the government and holding them to account.
And what did you do? Did you approach them? Did you call the guards? Is there any way that you can ensure they don't return to your house?
No, I called the guards. I mean, the guards had... This was a possibility previously whenever we were organising protests, you know, against the far right and organising in the community, organising Tala for All. So the guards had said previously to me, if something like this happened, to call them. So called the guards. The guards came to observe the situation. I didn't go out because I think that would just be the kind of confrontation that they would like to have. I mean, there's nothing. The guards can't stop them protesting, and I don't think people should be like. legally banned from protesting. I think there should be public pressure on people not to protest in local areas, but I think it would be a slippery slope to go down to say you can't protest here, you can't protest there.
So you wouldn't agree with this idea? I think there was a proposal at one point that they would introduce legislation to prevent people from protesting outside a politician's family home.
No, I wouldn't. I mean, obviously, I've never protested outside a politician's family home. I never would. I would encourage people not to, regardless of what side of the political spectrum they are.
You think that's crossing a line in terms of protests?
I do. I don't think people's families should be targeted in that way. I signed up for my views. Juniper certainly didn't sign up for any of my
10
views.
weeks.
We'll see what Juniper thinks about my views and what world outlook they're going to have when they grow up. So yeah, I think it does cross the line, but I'd be very hesitant to have any sort of legal bar on it, because I think the civil liberties, basic right to freedom of assembly is very, very important. So I just encourage those people to stop, not to be targeting people's homes, and to bring their protests to the Dáil or other appropriate places. Yeah,
Dr. Grimes, I want to go to you. Do you think there is evidence of sort of a far-right movement growing in Ireland, gaining pace, doing more of this?
So absolutely there is. Paul is far more principled than me. I think I'd be very upset if people were trying to intimidate. And I think we have to look at that as what this is. But one thing that's very interesting is that their protest is quite nebulous. If you look at it, they're ostensibly protesting about immigration, but they're handing out leaflets about gender identity. A few months ago, they were protesting about vaccine stuff. So what you tend to see in these movements is a sense of people being unhappy and adopting a wedge issue. So actors on the alt-right can absolutely use that, and the hard right can use a wedge issue to get, there's unhappiness over the housing crisis, there's a cost of living crisis. It's very easy in a conspiracy theory to say us versus them is the narrative, and that is the archetype of all conspiracy theories. They're exploiting you. They're bringing in immigrants to take your jobs. We see this in nativist movements. We see this in populist movements around the world.
It's playing on fears, isn't it? There's a sinister element to this.
It's very cynical, and it works really, really well. We've seen a lot of anti-refugee protests, which are entirely misplaced, but the rhetoric that stirs people up and kind of makes them fall down this rabbit hole is because these actors find a wedge issue like immigration and say that's why everything is going bad for you. And that's very sinister. That is, and it is, but it's also, integral to all conspiracy theories. Us versus them simplified down to a very stupid narrative and set people against each other. So we have to be aware of that.
Does it bring in people who would say, look, I have quite legitimate fears around perhaps the number of refugees coming into the country, or I have legitimate fears about the housing crisis, or I have legitimate fears about COVID or health or whatever. Does it bring those people
into the fold? It absolutely does. In fact, we saw that during the pandemic. We saw there was obviously lockdowns were hard on everyone. They weren't designed to be a permanent measure. But we saw a little bit of prototyping of this. We saw people's discontent and unhappiness being weaponized, being put into an us versus them narrative. I think Leo Varadkar had people outside his house in 2021, I think it was, protesting about vaccines and masks and things like that. So if you can tap in to someone's unhappiness, and these are wedge uses in politics. We saw it in 2016 in America. It was about race. Immigration is what that alt-rights or hard-right groups use in Europe, because that's always been a contentious issue. We also have an element of, it's a small element, but it does matter, of Russian disinformation that also targets those wedge issues. Because if you want to cause these fissures in society, that's what you do. You find the real valid unhappiness, and then you blame someone that doesn't deserve it for that, and you demonize a subsection of society, and that's what we're seeing here, for sure.
What role is social media playing in all of this? Is that to blame for the furtherance, for the
it's not to blame for it per se, but it doesn't help. It's an accelerant. So if you went years ago, if you went into a pub or whatever else and said something that was outlandish, someone would stop you and go, you're being stupid. Now I can go online and find people that will amplify those views. We have
somewhere in the world 100%. Somebody will agree with you.
So in 2016, the Columbia Journalism Review actually they flagged this. They said that the fact that we're becoming curators of our own media is making us more polarized. And it's a thing that conspiracy theorists and, say, these activists, they use a thing called stigmatized information. They won't trust the Irish Times or the Examiner or whatever. What they'll trust is some highly racist website, because that's what they put their trust in. And we're not listening to the middle ground or other people's opinions. We're getting more and more siloed. Information siloing is dangerous because no discomplimentary information can ever get to us. We can't get ourselves out of the rabbit hole. That's what social media is really toxic for.
Have you been targeted at all, Emer?
I think a lot of politicians have been. I suppose Paul has had a very serious experience in the last few days, and it's quite similar to what happened Minister Simon Harris and his wife and the time 3-week-old baby. And I totally disagree with that. You know, I don't think anybody should have to put up with that, whether they're an elected politician, no matter who they are. And I know this has also happened to people who aren't elected politicians. I know it happened previously to our chief medical officer. I don't think that's right. I do actually...
How do you put a stop to it?
Well, I do actually disagree with Paul on that. I think we do need to legislate for it. I think...
To make it an offence to protest outside a politician's family home or anybody's family home?
Anybody's family home would be my view. And I suppose the reason for that is because I believe you need to balance the right to protest with the right for privacy. I absolutely fully believe in the right to protest, but I don't believe in the right to intimidate people. I don't think anybody has that right. And I think that's what you choose to do if you choose to, instead of protesting outside someone's workplace or office or doll, decide to take it to outside their home where their family may be, young kids, elderly parents. Like this unfortunately has happened previously, about a decade ago. I know in your own area, a former colleague of mine, Brian Hayes, had posters put up in his home. That happened in Lucan for Derek Keating. I don't think that's right. I think people's homes should be off limits.
Louise, in terms of that legislation or that legislation that was suggested around, stopping protests outside family home, where are we at with that?
Yeah, so this has been suggested by Senator Malcolm Noonan. He's a Fianna Fáil senator, and this is an idea he had put forward. But I think there are concerns, and I think it comes back to what Paul says. I think people don't, and politicians don't want to be seen to tell people that they can protest, because it is a right to protest. People have that right. I think there is...
As Emer said, it has to be balanced against your right to privacy, perhaps, and that should be respected within the family home.
No, absolutely. But I think that is what people are finding difficult, and the politicians are finding difficult, is how do you strike that balance? And I don't know if it's going anywhere for now, unfortunately. In that sense, I think what the government are putting a lot of hope on is the online safety regulation bill, that social media might begin to tackle those kind of far-right comments online.
Yeah.
But it'd be interesting to see what happens.
My worry is if we don't tackle that we end up with a situation where we're putting people off becoming politicians. And I think we've just talked about the rise of the extreme right. And I suppose with extremism, now more than ever, we need people to put themselves forward for politics. And we can't let this become a barrier for anybody interested in doing that.
Dr. Grahams, what do you think needs to be done to try and counter this? This, as you say, quite sinister, quite dangerous.
I think, with the disclaimer, I have no political insight whatsoever. I'm not going to talk about legislation, but what I will talk about is fixing the problem long term. So you mentioned social media. I'm not sure if the bill, an Irish bill, is going to do much on that, because this is a systemic problem. Facebook
it's a global problem.
Well, Facebook's a bigger company than the economies of some countries, right? So you need a supranational way of doing it. I would say the only real shot we have is European legislation to make things a publisher. That might be one thing to do, and I've written about that before as an option, because again, social media is interested in engagement. People who tend to fall down these rabbit holes engage more than regular users. They are the profit makers for these things. No company is going to legislate against or voluntarily take any action against that. But the longer term problem, to solve that, we need to kind of train people to better recognize the tropes of misinformation, the tropes. If something makes you angry or outraged or disgusted, particularly if you read it online, there's a very good chance it was engineered to do that. We do know from all the studies we have on this, we can immunize people against misinformation if they know what to expect. It's much harder to pull them out of a rabbit hole when they've gone down. It's much easier to prevent them getting there in the first place. So maybe education is a long-term fix to that.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you to my panellists for joining me this evening.